From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead today, during his weekly segment on the grain market trends, K-State's Dan O'Brien will talk about the potential wet weather harvest delays and how the corn and soybean markets are responding. Then Sarah Moyer visits with K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz about taking soil samples from crop fields following harvest this fall, tailoring that sampling to what you producers need to know about the nutrient content of your given field. Later, K-State's Ajay Sharda will comment on the new research and education partnership announced yesterday between K-State and a leading precision agriculture technology firm. And standing by to talk Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp. All coming up on this Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome once again to our Friday edition. Grain markets are in the spotlight. First off today with Dan O'Brien, along once more, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, joining us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. And we look back on the trading action this past week, Dan, in the aftermath of what was a definitively bearish USDA grain stocks report just around this time last Friday. Interesting that the markets have quickly shifted their attention away from those numbers toward what's going on with the weather in respect to corn and soybeans anyway.
Yeah, you can see within the last week or so that on the day of that report, yes, it was, I don't know if we should say negative, but it certainly wasn't helpful to the information coming out of that didn't take corn, wheat, soybean futures higher. But since that time, weather forecasts, export movement, all those in combination have led to at least moderately higher prices. And I think for December corn, whereas about 2 weeks ago we were down to about 342, well, here we're at 367.5 on yesterday's close anyway. For hard red winter wheat, well, we've been as low as $5 within the last 2 to 3 weeks, up to about 522, had been higher to 530 or some. Again, not a tremendous increase, but it's not going lower. At least didn't go lower in that time. For soybeans, with all the trade discussions and challenges that we have there in that market at this time. Again, about 2.5-3 weeks ago, we had gotten down to about 825, 873 on yesterday's close. So goodness, just about 48, 45, 50 cents higher than where we had been. It just brings up the specter of what are we anticipating as a future direction, given that harvest is scheduled to come as soon as we get into the fields, can get everything out. And at this time, we're so often wondering about harvest time bottoms, et cetera. Well, here are these weather forecasts on top of already wet, saturated conditions up in Iowa, southern Minnesota, over into Wisconsin area, parts of northeast Nebraska, as well as, I guess, at least the southern parts of Indiana, Ohio, et cetera, parts of Illinois. We're basically wondering about now, how this moisture that's coming might slow down harvest and what that will do. I don't think that anybody is anticipating yet that, gosh, we're going to lose a sizable proportion of the crop. I really don't think that would happen unless we just set in and rain for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks, and then we'd have issues probably. But with this, what isn't happening is that we have open fields, open skies, dry conditions, and we're going great guns and in the harvest and piling grain on the ground. That's not happening. So if we're seeing at least some support coming to the markets now, and if it looks like with the moisture that's slated to come, we could be delayed for 1 or 2 weeks or maybe longer. what does that do for folks that are wondering about the need to generate cash sales? And
right.
Probably at the same time, they're probably wondering about getting their own grain out of the field. So depending on how they can maneuver that situation, it would seem that some of the support we're seeing now, although really kind of limited unless we go for 3 or 4 weeks with this, it's probably a selling opportunity if they are in position to be able to not be hampered by getting grain out of the field.
Something that aligns with the improved prices, you've illustrated this in your weekly notes on the grain trades, that is the strength in the overall economy. The stock market is doing quite well, and that is resonating in the commodities likewise.
Yes, the U.S. Federal Reserve Chair came out within the last week and indicated that we have a unique situation where we have the U.S. economy performing well, the stock market doing also positively, but then the one thing that you'd worry about in that scenario would be the specter of inflation heating up, with interest rates having to move sharply higher to try to control inflation. Well, it seems when you look at charts of the U.S. dollar, which would be reflective of where interest rates are going, again, high interest rates paid on people owning dollars, well, you raise the price of the dollar. Anyway, the price of the dollar, well, it's not weak, but it's moving pretty much sideways, whereas the economy overall is moving to the higher side, as witnessed by or at least anticipation that the economy is going to move there, given what the stock market is doing. So, interesting times. Still something to watch, I think. A risk for us here in the U.S. with our export orientation on corn, soybeans, wheat when that kicks in, and grain sorghum, we hope eventually, once we get on the other side of some of our trade disputes, we're vulnerable in terms of U.S. ag exports if we see a higher U.S. dollar. And so far, that has not materialized. If anything's limiting our exports, it has more to do with trade tensions. So we've got a situation going forth that I don't think anybody would begrudge the economy doing better. We just have that back of our mind fear that it might heat up inflation and that we'd suffer on the ag side. But so far it hasn't happened.
You mentioned right there, Dan, trade tensions. Well, maybe a measure of that tension was alleviated with the announcement that the next iteration of NAFTA, this will be called the U.S Mexico-Canada agreement, has been forged. It will have to be ratified by the respective representatives in each country. But this has taken some of the uncertainty out of the trade equation, hasn't it?
It has. I have not heard one U.S. commodity organization express negative feedback to that agreement. Again, especially in the grain sector, when they look to how much we have been shipping to Mexico in the past several years, to be able to have that door still open is a tremendous thing for U.S. agriculture. And, of course, there are a number of issues that come into play with regard to our relations with Canada. Again, in the ag sector, the main issue that was dealt with had to do with dairy. I guess a free flow of dairy products in an unhindered manner between the various countries. So those were good things. And again, Canada is a hard one-to-one competitor with us in terms of spring wheat export sales. So I don't know that what has transpired or is anticipated to transpire will affect that a lot in terms of our competition with Canada for wheat exports. But overall, again, looking at the auto sectors and other parts of that agreement seems to be a good and positive thing. And maybe it sets the stage, builds momentum, pressure, et cetera, for the U.S. to be able to forge out equitable trade agreements with the European Union on the one hand, and, of course, the main target, the main goal, to come up with a mutually beneficial trade agreement with China. And that one is, quote, still out there.
Yeah. Do want to bring up some information that you also have in your notes this week, the current basis bids in Kansas for corn and grain sorghum. We're seeing some shifting there, you say.
Yes. It's been a great thing at ethanol plants to see that both corn and grain sorghum here in Kansas have been doing well. In fact, the corn bid at Kansas ethanol plants, the top end of those bids has been the strongest bid of anywhere in the United States, and it still is at 20 over the D's contract, and the range being from 15 under D's to 20 over, and that's generally higher than we see for corn and grain sorghum in most other parts of the state. We do see some pretty strong corn bids out in the southwest part of the state near the cattle feeding side of things. What's weakened a little bit has been the basis bid now for grain sorghum. It's still very strong relative to most bids across the state in most places, but now it's, instead of being even money with futures or even over, now it's weakened just a little bit down to 20 under Ds. So I think that's just indicative of the challenge right now that grain sorghum grown in Kansas has on the demand side. Still, no doubt, a lot of grain sorghum will be bought at those prices, but the weakness in the supply-demand balance sheet for grain sorghum in the United States and in Kansas in particular, brought on by these trade tensions with China is, we'll just be polite and say it's very, very noticeable and has a tangible impact on the market price for that crop right now.
And one quick final item here, as the wheat drills roll around the state and we are progressing in winter wheat seeding in Kansas, we still are not moving much wheat in the export channels.
Yes, whereas for corn, we're seeing strong movement. For soybeans, sort of okay, not as bad as it could be. For wheat, there's the business that we should eventually see coming based on some tighter world stocks and given the quality of the 2018 wheat crop that we have. But again, it just has not brought about yet the business here to the U.S. In the week ending September 27th, just under 12 million bushels of wheat exports. We need a pace of about 22 to 23 to meet the USDA's expectations. So clearly, the USDA itself is anticipating that in coming months we'll see U.S. wheat exports pick up, but it just hasn't happened yet.
The sooner the better on that score. And the aforementioned notes on the grain markets that Dan has put together for this week can be found at agmanager.info, as always. Once more, agmanager.info out of K-State Agricultural Economics. Hey, Dan, thanks. Next week we'll get together once again.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
That from Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. And Agriculture Today continues after this break over the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. The fall season is a good time to be taking soil samples before the ground freezes. It's difficult sometimes to collect a representative sample, though. And to talk about the subject, we have K-State Nutrient Management Specialist Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. Good to have you on.
Good to be here.
First, let's talk about the basics. What is the need-to-know information about soil sampling?
Yes, soil sampling is really a key moving forward as we develop our fertility program for the next crop. And typically, a good time for thinking about soil sampling is after harvest this fall. We can do actually soil sampling even in the spring in most of Kansas as long as the ground is not frozen. So it's really a good timing to think about soil sampling in general. And again, as we are planning our fertility program for the next crop, basically all the decisions in terms of investing in fertilizer is going to be largely based on this information that we are collecting now. So yes, the quality of that information is very important. At the soil testing lab where I work, issues oftentimes tend to be more related to the actual sampling in the field to be able to get, again, a good representative sample and a sample that can give us accurate information to make that decision. So in many cases, we think about soil sampling as a very straightforward process. However, there are a lot of things that we have to keep in mind. And there are really 2 main factors when it comes to variability in soil sampling in the field. And one of those is the stratification of nutrients in the soil profile. In other words, typically we'll tend to have higher concentration of nutrients near the surface, especially those producers who have long-term no-till systems and application of fertilizer on the surface. stratification develops over time. So that's one variability that we have in the field. And of course, the main factor that's going to be affecting that stratification is going to be the sampling depth. If we are not consistent with the sampling depth, we may be getting either overestimated value or underestimated value. The second source of variability that we often see is the number of subsamples that we are collecting from the field. And there's really a minimum number of cores that we typically find to be ideal. Of course, the more subsamples, the more cores that we are collecting is typically better. However, of course, we know that there's have to be an economic threshold there. We cannot spend too much time in the field. A value of about 15 to 20 cores seems to be pretty consistent. We do have some research, fairly recent studies here in Kansas State where we found that to be about the threshold as the minimum number of subsamples we need to collect. And this is pretty much in agreement with other studies in other states as well.
Let's talk about the sampling pattern. How should these cores be collected within a field?
Yes, that's a very good point. And in general, of course, we want to get samples from uniform areas, representative areas. In other words, we want to avoid areas that we know is problematic or has some issues that's not going to be representative of that particular field. We want to avoid those type of areas unless we want to go and on purpose target those areas and try to figure out what's happening in those particular areas. But again, as we're trying to treat the entire field, of course, we want to avoid those problematic areas that are not representative of the field. We want to collect samples randomly, basically, in the field, keeping in mind the minimum number of subsamples that we need to collect. There are other factors that we need to consider in this case. One of those is also what's the previous management of that particular field. Specifically, if we're talking about fertilizer placement. If we have a field, for example, that has a strip till with fertilizer application over the years, we tend to have another source of variability in that case. And again, getting a soil core, a soil subsample right where we have a fertilizer ban the previous year, of course, we're going to have an increase in the value. And so how that plays basically in terms of our sampling guidelines, and a recent study that we did comparing traditional broadcast fertilization treatment versus a strip till, what we found is that if we are taking soil sample in that strip till field, we basically need to increase the number of subsamples significantly. Just a few minutes ago, we mentioned about 15 to 20 cores for a regular field, regular sampling. If we're talking about a long-term strip till or a situation where we have typically ban-applied fertilizer, we definitely want to increase that number of subsamples. And we are seeing that from our research, we want to be really around 20 or even more samples to get a more representative value for that field.
Speaking of management, is it important that producers sample after the same crop in order to compare results?
Yes, that's another excellent point. One of the main values, in my opinion, when we look at soil test data is to look at what happens over time. And I think that's something that producers need to keep in mind. Are we mining nutrients, or are we perhaps increasing nutrient levels? And that will kind of tie up to your fertility management in general. That long-term history, and like you mentioned, being somewhat consistent in terms of when we are collecting those samples is very important. The key is to be consistent in terms of when in that rotation you are collecting soil sample to be able to compare those values over time. Because, yes, we do have also some variability in soil test values depending on the time of the year and also what happening in terms of the crops. So consistency in terms of maintaining a database of soil test values over the years has a lot of value for producers to, again, make adjustments if needed.
Other than the consistency points that you just mentioned with the time of year and so on, if a farmer is looking at a key nutrient or pH specifically, does that affect how the farmer would then be taking the sample or what pattern they should be using?
Yes, that's another excellent point. Again, we mentioned earlier about consistency in sampling depth. And when we talk about immobile nutrients like pH or phosphorus, like you mentioned, K-State recommendation is typically for a sampling depth of 6 inches. So that's a sampling depth that we tend to recommend. If it is specifically for pH and lime is going to be applied on the surface in a no-till systems, in other words, we're not going to incorporate that lime, in that situation, we will recommend a 3-inch sampling depth. That would be the only situation where a 3-inch will be recommended. Otherwise, again, other immobile nutrients will stick with the 6-inch sampling depth. That's following K-State guidelines, but I know some producers use different sampling depths. I know some producers use 8 inches, for example, and that's okay as long, again, as we are consistent when we are collecting those samples and we are following through also with the right lab. Because, again, K-State recommendations are based on 6 inches, but, again, other labs may be providing recommendations based on a different sampling depth. The key point is, again, just to be consistent in terms of how we are collecting those samples.
Would you talk for a moment about how to submit a soil sample once it is collected?
Yes, the K-State Soil Testing Lab, we do provide service to producers and an extension in general, anyone that wants to submit samples to the lab. Typically, for the immobile nutrients, we can basically submit the sample, collect the number of cores that we need, the number of subsamples can be submitted via labels that we can print it from our website. Anyone can do that and submit it to the lab. Once we get those samples, we'll dry it and process. So there's really not a lot of need from the producer to dry it or process that sample before submitting the samples. Again, those are for immobile nutrients. Now, specifically, if we are looking at profile for nitrogen, in particular nitrate, those samples we would like to get it as soon as possible, because if we are leaving those samples sitting in the pickup for a few days or something like that, then the values can change and can be affected. If the producer is not going to be able to submit those samples immediately, we typically recommend to let it dry. You can just put it on paper and spread the soil sample on top of a table and let it dry.
How often should producers be investing in taking these soil samples?
That's an excellent question, and I think we mentioned earlier, traditionally we talk about every 3 to 4 years. Many producers will collect samples during that time frame, but in reality, we are making decisions in terms of fertilizer dollars based on this information. And in many cases, specifically in the case of phosphorus, it could be cost-effective to collect samples every 2 years. In other words, be more frequent in terms of how we are collecting those samples. And for us in Kansas, that could make sense, especially because we can have highly variable yields. Some years we have good rains and yield potential could be significantly improved. Other years we have drought and crop failure, and of course the removal of nutrients are going to be much, much lower. Being able to predict basically how much removal and how much change in soil tests will happen over a period of time, for many of our regions that's a little bit difficult, again, because of that variability in productivity that we have from year to year. So a more frequent sampling every 2 years could be a good idea.
Generally, how much do soil samples cost to have tested?
It typically varies by the nutrients that we are requesting, but typically in average about $10 will tend to cover most of the basic nutrients. And again, depending on what else we are asking for, either a complete analysis or, again, if we are just looking at a single nutrient, for example, again, phosphorus, if we want to just look at that in particular, of course, that would be much cheaper and we are only looking at a particular nutrient. For example, we do have producers that do grid sampling, full analysis, organic matter, pH, and so on. That can be done maybe every 4 years and maybe come back every 2 years and just do a quick check on phosphorus without the need to do a full grid analysis.
A wealth of knowledge can be gained here from these soil samples, and thank you for coming on and discussing this with us, Dorivar.
Thank you.
Once again, that was K-State Nutrient Management Specialist Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz discussing soil sampling. I'm Sarah Moyer, and we'll have more here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. Well, a leading precision agriculture technology development firm announced yesterday a comprehensive partnership with Kansas State University. Topcon Agriculture has signed a master research agreement with K-State to develop tools and systems to advance precision agriculture. The new Topcon Agriculture Research Campus will be established in the K-State Office Park. This campus will create a precision agriculture classroom space with state-of-the-art equipment to train students, faculty, and customers, incorporating technology into farming and agricultural practices. The company is also donating technology infrastructure improvements and equipment for the university's nearby Agronomy North Farm and will streamline access to future upgrades. Beyond Manhattan, this partnership with K-State's Polytechnic campus in Salina and K-State Research and Extension will help Topcon Agriculture conduct on-farm research around the state. As this arrangement was coming together, one of the key contacts on the K-State side, Research and Extension Precision Agricultural Engineer Ajay Sharda, who is quite enthused about what this partnership will bring to the benefit of Kansas agricultural producers.
I think this partner signifies the talent and the capacity K-State has in terms of engaging in research, engaging with the industry partners to work on the cutting-edge technology which is out there, helping those manufacturers to grow their technology, bring relevance and value and meaning in terms of those products to the producers, because ultimately it is everything about getting those things in the producer's hand so producers can be more productive, more profitable, and grow crops in a more sustainable manner.
So the partnership will allow for those causes to be achieved more quickly and more effectively as we go through time?
Absolutely, because with the engagement of the faculty here, the bigger goal is to engage faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students, train them, give them an opportunity to work with the latest and greatest in terms of technology, give them skills which are necessary for them to be successful in their careers, but also start to build capacity around campus. So we are ready for newer partnerships. I don't think and I don't believe the Topcon should be the first and the last one to have on campus, because this will ultimately start to put ourselves in the league where we say, hey, we can go out and have similar things with CNH and similar things with John Deere's and other big brands and AGCOs to really expand what should a research park look like on K-State campus.
So the partnership is in place now. What specific precision agricultural technology initiatives do you think will take shape from this partnership? Is there any singular technology that you think will really advance forward because of this arrangement?
I think there are a number of them. As you may have heard from these guys, the crop spec, which is the crop sensors for canopy sensing, is one of the focus. From the bio and ag engineering department, there are all the controllers, the GPS technology they have for liquid application for planters, that is another focus. But I think the global assimilation of all these technologies is the bigger picture. So they want to bring all the data pieces from different data layers in terms of production ag and start to give solutions, whether they are cloud-based solutions or more like subscription-based. But I think that is where our knowledge will expand more. We'll have live examples coming from our fields, our growers, and we'll have more knowledge on how to use those data layers, what kind of analytics we should do it, and finally make better and informed decisions about crop input use.
K-State's Ajay Sharda, among the Topcon officials attending yesterday's ceremony, was a native Kansan who serves as the company's customer support manager, Jared Oakes. He says this partnership will lead to multi-layered development of precision agricultural technology that will emulate how the real farming world works.
A key component of what we will hope to achieve over the course of the next few semesters at the university is really to tie all those components together so it's a seamless, just like a grower wakes up and feeds heifers in the morning and sprays in the afternoon and maybe does some tillage or light seeding in the evening. That's what our product needs to do, seamlessly, just as the grower does that. They don't change clothes after every one of those operations. They run throughout the course of the day. And our business needs to operate like that, and the systems and technologies we create need to also enable that workflow seamlessly from one to another to another.
Jared Oakes of Topcon Agriculture, which has just forged a research partnership with Kansas State University to advance precision agriculture. It was unveiled in ceremonies here on the campus yesterday. Taking us up to the break, this week's edition of the Kansas Wheat Scoop. Now, here's Marcia Boswell.
Entries for the 2019 National Festival of Breads, sponsored by Red Star Yeast, King Arthur Flour, and the Kansas Wheat Commission, are being accepted now through January 1st, 2019. The competition seeks the best yeast bread recipes from home bakers and food bloggers throughout the United States. Individuals who are avid amateur home bread bakers and do not make the major portion of their income by baking bread may enter the home baker division. Individuals who currently maintain an active food blog and include wheat foods and yeast bread recipes as part of their content may enter the food blogger division. Adult bakers ages 18 and up can self-identify their division and submit original recipes online at nationalfestivalofbreads.com. Submissions, which require photos of the entered bread, will only be accepted through the online form. Judges will evaluate all entries and select 8 adult finalists, 4 from each division, each of whom will receive airfare and accommodations to participate in the national competition on June 8, 2019 in Manhattan, Kansas. In addition, each finalist will receive a $500 cash award, participate in a wheat harvest tour to a Kansas wheat farm and flour mill, and learn about wheat research at the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center. 2 grand prize winners will be awarded, 1 from each division. These grand prize winners will receive a trip to attend a baking class of their choice at the King Arthur Flour Baking Education Center in Vermont or Washington State, and a 1-year supply of Red Star yeast. The full list of rules, past recipes, and a summary of the past 5 competitions are available at nationalfestivalofbreads.com. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And we'll return shortly here on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and to close out today's edition, it's a look at Kansas agricultural weather once again with Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension, and our featured topic will be this wet weather, which will, in a sense, overrun Kansas in the days ahead. But before we get to that, the recap on September, you have that for us now from the Weather Data Library.
Right. Basically, September was wetter and warmer than normal if you look at the state as a whole. There were 2 divisions that ended up on the drier side of things. That was the Northwest Division. They averaged just under an inch of rainfall, which is about 60% of what they would normally expect to get. The other area that was short on the rain was the East Central. They had more moisture, 2.94 inches, but it was still only 80% of what they would normally expect. When you look at that on a year-to-date basis, Northwest isn't faring bad. They're still 100% of what they should be for the year-to-date. as are most of the divisions. But when you get to the East divisions, they fall a little bit further behind, and the East Central is only 69% of their normal, which is why it's not a surprise that they still have exceptional drought to extreme drought, moderate drought, severe drought. The whole gamut is in there. The rains that started out September basically just nibbled away at the edges of that persistent drought in the eastern portions of the state.
But the odds are fairly good that drought remaining in Kansas will go away over the next 2 or 3 days. Again, more on that in a second. The temperature trends in September, was it a warmer than normal month?
It actually was a warmer than normal month. Statewide, we averaged 69.9 degrees, which is 1.8 degrees warmer than normal. Just on the warm side of the middle range, if you look at our historical weather patterns. Started out the month on a fairly wet note. We hit 105 out in western Kansas. Johnson in Stanton County was the winner of that prize, if you can call it that. But we also ended on a very cool note, dropped down to 30 degrees at Brewster in Sherman County. So again, quite a range of temperatures. And while they weren't as extreme in the other areas of the state, we still did see the roller coaster of warm temperatures quickly displaced by a cold front bringing in the very cool temperatures. When you look at the warmth, most of that was driven by the nighttime lows staying elevated. So you look at our records that were set during the month, there were 10 daily record high maximums, 10 daily record cold maximums, and 27 record warm minimums. So again, the heat was really driven by those low temperatures.
And this first week of October more or less has followed that pattern?
Yes, we have had the warm air. We did get up to 100 degrees in one location on our Mesonet readings earlier this week. We've not hit freezing, but we have had some very cool temperatures. And in fact, yesterday, northwest Kansas struggled to get above 30 for their highs. So a very cool side to that frontal system. And that's going to be what's going to be driving our rainfall that we've already alluded to, that we can look at coming in the next couple of days.
And in fact, this rain event or series of events, more appropriately, is likely to sideline our producers from winter wheat planting, from row crop harvesting. Share the expected amounts and how this is all going to play out, Mary.
Well, when we look at the quantitative precip forecast, we see a very big area of heavy rainfall. In south central Kansas, where we're going to get the brunt of that, they may see upwards of 10 inches of rain in the week that ends next Friday. There's an even broader area that basically is anywhere east of Hayes, where they may see somewhere between 5 and 7 inches of rain. When you go west of Hayes, the amounts drop off fairly quickly, but you're still looking, and once you get to the Kansas-Colorado border, of somewhere between 3/4 of an inch and 1.25 inches of rainfall. In the western parts of the state, as we already noted, northwest Kansas was on the dry side for September. 1 inch to 1.25 inches of rainfall over a 7-day period could be very welcome and beneficial for that wheat that's already in the ground and not really delay field activity too terribly much. It's going to be in the central and eastern parts of the state where heavy rainfall totals are going to create problems with saturated soils and maybe a fairly long delay getting back into the field in a reasonable manner.
Important to note, though, these rainfall totals will be well dispersed over several days' time as opposed to a deluge in 1 or 2 events, which hopefully will keep the flash flooding to a minimum.
Well, flash flooding will still be a risk because when you get, say, for example, we had some rains that came in Wednesday night into Thursday morning, saturated those grounds in that area. And there were places in south central Kansas that saw upwards of 4 inches of rain. So it won't take much to bring those streams and rivers up for the flooding event. But unlike our Labor Day storm, where we got 11 inches in 24 hours, this is going to be spread out over most of the next week. There are chances going into tonight, again, very good chances Saturday night, most of Sunday, Sunday night, Monday, and really doesn't drop below the 50-60% chance until we get into Thursday and Friday of next week. And for producers that are interested in more details on what's setting up this particular problem, you can check out the Agronomy e-update that will be released this afternoon, and it's more about what the quantitative forecast is, what are the components that are setting up this rainy pattern, and what are the implications for harvest and for winter wheat planting.
Have a look at that. It's very descriptive of what we have ahead of us at agronomy.ksu.edu. That'll be posted in the e-update later on this afternoon. Mary, we appreciate it. Thanks for coming over.
Thanks, Eric.
Updating us on Kansas agricultural weather and the outlook for the next several days, that's Research and Extension climatologist at K-State, Mary Knapp. Thanks to you as well for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.